Yeah.
Actually, it's just like the thing you need the greatest part about this. I got I'm not going to touch things that I don't destroy. Sparkle, wiggle, roll. I need a maker. Usually I don't mind that. Detroit, Michigan. That's right. No, no. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Here we are, not in the public building. Thank you, Kyron, for making that happen. Not that magical things don't happen in the public building. Because magical things happen in the public building all the time, but it is kind of nice to have light, have air, and to be together yet again for another Writing Now event. What? So especially if you are coming even from, let's say, photo media, I see some photo makers here, or from some other parts of CalArts, we're so happy to have you. And just in case you don't know, my name is Gabrielle Seville. I am a faculty member in the MFA program in creative writing, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Writing Now, Martine Whitehead. Has been anything like mine, maybe it takes you a minute to just like arrive. And so I want to invite you actually to make sure that you're feeling more present, more comfortable, more grounded. That might mean, ooh, I see someone already doing that. Could mean letting yourself stretch. That could mean closing your eyes for a minute. That could be rolling your neck. I mean, what does it actually take to feel like you've arrived, like you are somewhere? I mean, and then a little ritual gesture never hurt either. I mean, I would invite you, if it feels good, to like brush off of you what you don't need. Just brush it off you. Whoa, look. Whatever is sticking to you or is trying to stick to you, brush it off. And then gather to you what your spirit craves. Just bring it to you. Ooh, you can even like coat yourself with it if you want. Ooh, doesn't that feel so nice? Right? Doesn't that feel so nice? To arrive with some sense of the body and to engage in practices of the body as a part of writing community, this, for me, is an important part of our concentration on writing and performativity in our program. And tonight's featured guest has arrived in part in this room, in this school, to help us think about writing and performativity. But when we think about here, where we are, it's important to think about the here in a more expanded way as well. So I'm proud to share that the CalArts main campus sits on the unceded ancestral lands of the Chagwa-Yabatam, the people of Chagwayanga, I love that, whose present-day descendants are citizens of the Fernandeño, see, it's like that Spanish language that got in my mouth there, the Fernandeño, Tatavian, Verde, Mission Indians. Now, this part, for me, is the most powerful. I mean, this is like standard language, but I don't mind saying it because I think this part is really beautiful. They have been here for millennia and will forever call this place home. What does it mean to have been in a place for millennia and to still call that place home? That feels powerful to me. So through meaningful partnership and collaboration, CalArts is committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. But, and I'm going to follow my colleague Matthias Wegner in this, it's one thing to say some words. It's another thing to think about, actually kind of lifting up Native voices or considering the connections of Native people to the community. So I wanted to share this with the help of Erica Minns. We've been having like some interesting, the new security systems here have been giving us a problem. But how many of you know Mercedes Durame, who is a faculty member here? You do. Well, I wanted to lift up this show, Mercedes Durame, Where Sky Touches Water. And I'm actually going to pass this floating laptop around because Mercedes is a faculty member here, also in photo media in the art school, and is also someone who takes a lot of inspiration from her Tongva ancestry. So the Tongva are not the exact people of CalArts, but you know, they're neighbors. And we have this member of our community who has this beautiful show. And as you can see in this image, you see like moss, you see a little lichen, etc. And that feels important for this introduction as well for Martine, because as those of you who are in the room today know, Martine loves moss and loves lichen and mushrooms and zombies and other things. And as we were talking, and Martine, is it fair to say you were geeking out on that? Is that fair to say?
Well, I think collectively.
Collectively, no, you're right. And in fact, that's why I'm mentioning this, because as we were talking about it, you really spoke to how these things that we were talking about, moss, and lichen, and zombies, and fungi, are models of embodied collective growth and knowledge. And in our conversation, I feel like I heard you even say, this is how mass movements work, or this is how mass movements can work. So really thinking about landscape and trying to make a connection between where we are now, what has been here before, and what could be, that feels like an important hallmark of your work. And something that makes me so excited to have you here. One other thing that I wanted to share is that Martine and I were able to have a conversation about sort of performance dreams in the moment of like 2020. And it was a part of a series called Black Motion Pictures. And at the start of our conversation, Martine said, I am a person who uses my body to tell different stories. And I like working with people to figure out their stories in their bodies. So tonight, we'll get to hear more about this kind of storytelling and the relationship between storytelling and embodiment, or storytelling and the body. And we'll also consider the relationship between embodiment, storytelling, and writing in different forms. And Martine Whitehead is an artist, writer, choreographer, and curator. They make solos and collaborative work interrogating race, gender, time, and loss at the limits of performance, and have shown work throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. Martine has worked with many, many incredible people. And since the recent death of Popel, they've been recirculating endurance tests, a recurring column in Art Practical, exploring Black creative practice in their Substack. Recognized with many awards and fellowships, Martine has written about Blackness, queerness, and bodies in Action for Art 21, Freeze, Queer Dance, Meanings and Makings, and more. Martine is the author of Treasure, My Black Rupture, which many of us here have had a chance to read, and is the creator of Force, with an exclamation point, an opera in 3 acts, which is showing at Red Cat in Los Angeles this spring. So without further ado, welcome.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Seville.
Yes. Say more.
Thank you to the second year cohort for letting me crash your class. And I hope that this does something else for you that earlier today didn't, but I encourage you to make it do something else for you. By way of questions or whatever that means. Okay, so this is gonna be, I heard, some people said, performance when they talked about what I was gonna do tonight, and some people said reading. And I wasn't really planning on a performance or reading, but I am going to give a talk, which I guess is me reading in a performative way. And I'm really gonna talk, like I'm looking at these presenter notes and talking so that I can keep track of my thoughts. I'm calling this talk Making Operas in a Genocide, to account for untold genocides and untold operas. The title of this talk is indebted to the long history of artists, thinkers, and activists who have told stories of their survival and of those who did not survive. In particular, as far as titles go, I'm very inspired by David Gear's 2004 How to Make Dances in an Epidemic, and David France and ACT UP's 2012 How to Survive a Plague. The title of this talk is also in honor of the writers who've told their stories and the stories of their people from inside and from the edges of prison. Writers like Mumia Abu-Jamal, Assata Shakur, George Jackson, and Asha Mahmoudeh. And lastly, this talk is an acknowledgement of all the journalists who are actively telling the stories of their survival and of those who have not survived. People like Hassan Auda, Wissam Nassar, and Motaz Azaiza. Those who have risked their lives and sometimes died to tell us the stories of people and not numbers. And those who've been asking, why should we keep telling our stories if nobody cares? Which is a really important question. So this talk is dedicated to the storytellers. And first, I think we have to start with which genocides, because there's so many. And I certainly mean physical death, but many of us outside of active genocide zones have been rapidly learning about the legal definition of genocide, anyway, according to the UN Genocide Convention, and have come to understand that it also includes physical disablement, sterilization, kidnap, especially kidnap of children, and overall degradation of life on a mass scale with the intent to make the lives of a particular group unlivable. That's the UN Genocide Convention language. Even in stating that list of qualifiers with that cold language of international law, it's apparent to me that many of us belong to groups which are outside of active genocide zones, but are experiencing or have experienced in the recent past one or all of these violences. What else to call the medical and social experiments carried out on Black and Indigenous people in North America over the last 500 years? The kidnappings and reprogrammings, the forced sterilizations, the unaccounted for disappearances from schools and hospitals, the neighborhood bombings, the withholding of treatment for diseases, the violent experimentation of treatment on live subjects in the name of science, the poisoning of water and air, the corralling into neighborhoods and schools that function as open-air prisons, the redlining and forced removal to reservations. What else to call those? And I say all this not to distract from the particular horrors currently being leveled against people all over the world in ways that, according to the International Court of Justice, can be and has been called as recently as last month genocide, and as recently as the other day. And not to let us forget about their particularities or about our role as, those of us who are paying taxes in countries that are playing a role in those particularities. It's the particularities that pull what is happening in places like Sudan and Gaza right now out of the land of demographics and strategy and into the space of story and meaning. And we need to dwell in those particularities much, much more, I think, than we have been. So I'm going to give this talk, and this is how I'm opening it, but I'm not doing this to distract away from those particularities. Instead, I want to start this conversation from a place of radical empathy and solidarity, which goes beyond a vague feeling of care and extends into a keen awareness that many of us already have shared experience with those we consider not here or not part of this present group or otherwise other. And it's not a metaphor to say that many of us have direct experience with that which would qualify as tactics of genocide, either as survivors or as perpetrators, and in fact, many times as both. I mean, Gabrielle gave the land account. So we start from that place. This place, what Fred Moten calls the radical binocularity of understanding that there is a specificity to the term genocide and to the places where genocide is happening, and also that extending that term to our own experiences when applicable is not a matter of metaphor, and it should not be metaphor. We should feel where that word lives in our own bones and our own landscapes and our own architectures. So that's how I start this talk that I will give imminently. One place we can locate this intent to destroy a group as articulated by the UN, I would argue, is in prison. This is not an unidentified prison waiting room, but I just couldn't bear to title it. So I left it unidentified. For a long time, I've been thinking about prison, as I shared with some of you earlier today. I have family members who have served time or have otherwise been in the system. Since 2006, I've worked directly with folks in or recently released from prison and jail as an artist and organizer in Philly with Spiral Q, and independently in San Francisco and in Chicago with the Prison Neighborhood Arts Education Project. And while living in LA, where I lived here from 2008-ish to 2011-ish. No, 2011 to 2014-ish. While living here, I became further enmeshed in the complex. My friend and roommate got 5 years after violating parole. And my best friend began a committed relationship and ended up becoming engaged with a man serving a life sentence upstate. And I continued to do my work while also feeling this deepening proximity to the whole of the drain of prison that some of us sort of circle around. You just circle and you get pulled down and down and down into the hole. And it feels inescapable for so many reasons. And I felt myself getting pulled around the rim of the hole. I think it's important as I do this thing that I'm doing right now, I'm going to keep doing for the next 40 minutes or so. It's important for you all to understand that I come to this work as someone without immediate family in law enforcement or like the correction officer side of things. So I come to this work as someone with people incarcerated. And I have a particular perspective for that reason. Okay, so in 2014, I moved from LA to Chicago and I started writing poems that in 2016 would be gathered into this little tiny book called Treasure, My Black Rupture. This was my first attempt, I think, to try to better understand the totalizing impacts of living inside carceral America, which is to say America. The book of prose and poetry represents an early effort on my part to draw a line through my experiences as an educator in the United States and as a light-skinned Black girl and a child of a Virginia sharecropper, and my relationships with friends and family caught in the system. And we can recall, as we did earlier today, that this time, 2014-ish, catalyzed Black Lives Matter. In particular, that couple of years, 2014 until the book's publication in 2016, was a period of explosively visualized Black death. Mike Brown, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Michelle Clouseau, Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald, Tanisha Anderson, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, and Alton Sterling were all killed by police within that 2-year span. And may we say their names and keep the memories of all those whose names we don't have. So in that couple of years before this social media landscape that we live in, we were receiving the visuality of Black Death on a scale we hadn't really dealt with before. So I was most definitely grieving during that time, and I was inundated, and I was sort of meditating in the midst of being inundated and grieving. I was thinking a lot about what death looks like, what death feels like, what death is. Like, when can we say that someone has reached the point of death? And is that the same thing as disappearing? And what's the relationship between death and sharing a body with someone? And what happens when the dead don't disappear, or when we don't allow them to disappear? These were all things I was thinking about. And we already discussed that I have an aversion to reading. So you all can read this, or you can listen to me talk, and it's going to be a different version of the same thing. So by the time the book came out, the other thing that I also shared earlier, I'd been having this chronic eczema, a result of stress-induced inflammation for years. So eczema presents as this like reddish brown ring on the surface of the skin, and it can serve as a reminder that our bodies are not wholly our own. Or we have to reconstruct our understanding of our, or what it means to own our own bodies. Eczema is often tied to fungal infections, and throughout the book I'm considering what it might mean to be in a parasitic relationship with fungi, and what it might mean for the I if we agree that fungi in particular is at least as much a part of ourself as what we think is ourself. I critically expand in the book Aimé César's late 1930s description of the white imaginary of Blackness during and in the wake of slavery as walking compost, hideously promising tender cane and silky cotton. That's César's words from Notebook of a Return to the Native Man. And so I was thinking about composting and what is compost in the hands of Black people, and what it would mean to be compost and to be available to decomposition, which is what's happening anyway, like we're decomposing right now. For me, this reveals a conceptual entanglement between some African American concerns with self-composition, or like a kind of respectability politics, and Black decomposition away from the human, the non-resting state of fugitivity from legality, from cisgender, from sanity, from legibility, decomposition. And I mean, there's a word in there which is compose, and as a musician, that feels important too. Like, what is it to decompose? Some lines in the book. Beautiful and face down, I am unremarkable. I am overly remarked upon. As I waste away, I am composed into a subject to be wasted. And we are ground cover. We make ourselves into fruit that hangs low. We make ourselves sugary and easily harvested. We are lives that do not stand vertically. And Nasser al-Aqi balks at his son's value, his son not even walking compost, for which the city now spends tax money on bends. His son not even this, not even a bend or the taxes that buy it, not even a fungal thing that might grow into a rampant thing and a bright and uncatchable thing. A usable body must demonstrate its use, which is the words of Don Lundy Martin. Nasser, communing with his son, makes himself worthless. So that book was happening, and just on the heels of that, I started working on this project, Notes on Territory. And maybe because I had been writing so much at that point now, I'm thinking maybe that's how Notes on Territory happened, which was really a writing project. It was a dance lecture. It was about contemporary prison architecture and its relationship, historical relationship to cathedrals, forts, and castles, the castle's relationship to slavery by way of slave castles. Slave castles were also called slave factories because they housed and employed what in the 17th and 18th century was called factors. A factory, a factor as we understand it now is, I think it's used mostly just in finance. It's like somebody who finances a corporation, essentially, and it's not really a person. But several centuries ago, factors were more generally business agents. They were generally buyers and sellers. So slave factories were the places where factors were buying and selling slaves. Also, I mean, slave factories, I believe that they were called that. I mean, this is anachronistic, but I believe that they were called that because they were also the place where people became slaves. They were raw material who were produced as slaves. I'm going to share some images, which are drawings and etchings and paintings of first-person accounts of different slave factories or slave castles or slave forts from Ghana. All these images are different forts, but they're all from a collection at the University of Chicago in their archives. So here is Almina Castle, which is one of the more famous, still standing. You can go visit it. Here's Fort Christiansburg. Here's Fort Nassau. Here is Fort Orange on top of the hill, which is still functioning now as a lighthouse. Here's Fort Commenda, and I just think that this is interesting, the site plan. I think it's an interesting design that shows up in several of the forts. Okay, so slave factories, why were they also called slave castles? And they look like castles. That's why, because they're castles. In fact, they were the catalyst of a 17th century resurgence of castles. By the 17th century, European artillery had developed to an extent that castles were not really being built anymore. They weren't a suitable defense structure. But starting in the 16th and then continuing into the 19th century, European powers brought castles back in Africa. They were almost always built on the coast, and these castles represented for Africans the door of no return, the gateway between home and the sea, which would continue the work of the castle in making these individuated people into Black people and then into slaves. And you know, something interesting just in thinking about architectural histories and its relationship to extraction and place is these castles weren't built with material from the places where they were built, which is why so few of them remain standing. They actually didn't last that long. They weren't suited for the place they were in. They were usually made out of material that was being shipped from the country to build the castle. Here's Fort Gross Fredericksburg, which, and you see again, it has a similar kind of a similar shape as Commenda. And this castle is also still functioning. It's now a tourist rest house. Oh, and here's a video that I like of when we had a Black president and he went to visit a slave castle.
I'm Anderson Flynn from Cape Coast, Ghana, and this is a special edition of 360
Different
President
time.
Obama's African Journey. We're coming to you from Cape Coast Castle, one of several fortresses along the West African coast, through which an estimated 10 to 40 million enslaved Africans were shipped off to the New World, many of those, of course, ending up in America. The president came here as part of a presidential trip, his first presidential trip to sub-Saharan Africa. But it's also a trip that is in many ways deeply personal for President Obama. It's a journey that encompasses both the politics of today and the still painful memories of our past.
As you walk around this castle, what's your other?
Well, obviously, it's a powerful moment for not just myself, but I think for Michelle. And the girls. You know, I'm reminded of the same feeling I got when I went to Buchenwald with Ellie Wiesel. You know, you almost
Okay,
feel.
and I'm just gonna stop it on that frame because I just have to point out the difference between Cape Coast and Buchenwald. I mean, Cape Coast looks like a castle. Like it literally looks like a castle. It looks like a palace. This is because this is where the factors would be, right? This isn't the dungeon where the slaves were. This is what Buchenwald looks like. Buchenwald looks like a prison, or maybe how we think of a prison. But even as I say this, I'm like, what am I saying? Because Cape Coast was also a prison. And this is also a prison. I mean, Cape Coast was a prison, actually literally a dungeon, which is what prisons were called before 18th century reforms. So there's an issue here with the distinction that I'm making, or the visual distinction that we make. There's a problem here. This, Buchenwald, is a place where people were kidnapped to, disabled, and subjected to degradation that would make life unlivable. And this, Cape Coast Castle, was also a place that people were kidnapped to, disabled, and subjected to degradation that would make life unlivable. And this, Stateville Prison, near where I live, is also a place that people have been kidnapped to, disabled, and subjected to degradation that would make life unlivable. And how can I say that? I can say disabled because I personally know people physically disabled by corrections officers at Stateville. I can say degradation because I've been advised many times not to drink the water at Stateville that people have to drink, and I've been degraded at Stateville as a person who doesn't live there. And I can say kidnapped because we know that people were brought to Stateville as a result of kidnappings and forced confessions. In 2015, the city of Chicago acknowledged this after the long efforts of many Chicagoans. Under CPD Commander John Burge, over 120 people, mostly Black men, were kidnapped off the streets of Chicago, tortured into forced confessions, and locked up for long sentences, sometimes death sentences. We don't know how many were forced to confess under the Burge regime. We do know that at least 20 people remain incarcerated as a result of convictions based on coerced confessions. And this is where I cut in the talk because I feel like, what am I even talking about? Like I feel off track, or like I don't know what the track was. And this happens a lot when I'm thinking about prison because it's boundaryless. As usual, I get caught up in the way, despite the design, the stated function of the design of prison, which is meant to contain. I get caught up in the way that the suffering of prison is so uncontainable. It just extends and extends, and that's the hole that I'm talking about, or that's the rim on the edge of the hole. So, okay, so as I was saying, in 2017, I was making this piece, Notes on Territory. I was drawing this architectural line between cathedrals and forts and castles. And as I was making it, I kept thinking about the other things that happen in architectures of containment. Spaces not originally designed by us, meant to do the work of factories, right? To transform us from individuated people with whole lives into prisoners or slaves or whatever. But I was still consistently going in and out of prisons like Stateville and spending quality time with people who are individuated people, who have lives and loves and names and families and things that piss them off and things that make them happy. So how can that be, right? How can these be death factories where people are living? How can any of us go through a factory and still be a person? I always recall this 2011 interview with a mother who lived in the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects in St. Louis before they were destroyed. These little apartments in this really fucked up complex, which you can, there's a great documentary called The Pruitt-Igoe Story, which I encourage you all to watch. But these little tiny apartments, the complex was flawed from its start, from its construction, and it was so thoroughly abandoned by the city that it eventually had to be demolished. And so this one woman is interviewed in the film. She had a caseworker who would come over from the Department of Social Services every month to make sure she didn't have any men living in the house, because this is the time when if you had a man living in the house, it meant that you didn't need social services because you had somebody who could make money. So she had this caseworker who would come over every month, and that meant that every month she had to repaint her wall by the time the caseworker came over. She had to repaint her wall because she would paint it back to black every month. And so why would you paint your wall black, especially in a cramped apartment? She painted her wall black because she knew her children were getting substandard educations, and so she used the black wall as a chalkboard to go over the lessons with her kids every night. And of course, the caseworker could never know that, because then she questioned the sanity of a woman who paints her tiny apartment wall black. These are the paradoxes I was coming up against as I was doing this research regarding mass Black death, but daily encountering alive Black people, even in spaces that absolutely manufacture Black death. There must be something else that happens in those places. It can't just be death. It is death. It's definitely death, but there must be something else that happens there. So,
Wow.
it's happening.
I
Yeah.
know.
Cut.
Yeah.
Simple energy.
So this is all happening, and also I was studying with Harriet Jacobs, who some of you might know. Harriet Jacobs was an educator, mother, activist, and abolitionist, and a fugitive from slavery. And in 1861, she wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which some of us might have read in high school or college. I appreciate that. Thank you. So in this book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs describes the windowless attic in which she lived for 7 years. This attic, the attic to her grandma's house, that she lived for 7 years. She calls it her loophole of retreat. To be clear, she stayed in the attic. She didn't leave the attic. She got her food in the attic. She expelled waste in the attic. The attic was 7 by 9 by 3 feet. And there was one hole where she could see her children growing up. But it was her loophole of retreat. And she says in the book that it's because even despite all the degradation of that attic, she was not a slave, she was a person. I can really get with this because I know all kinds of people who spend much of their lives within architectures of containment, whether they be prisons or housing, or we were talking about predominantly white institutions earlier. I would most certainly call PWIs architectures of containment. And this not to deny that these spaces are and can be disabling, violent sites of trauma. But inside of them, we find the loophole. That was your question, and I think that's, we find the loophole.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Harriet Jacobs has the answer, actually. We find the loophole. We come back to personhood. Okay, so as I was saying, I was making this dance lecture, and I realized that as part of it, I needed to rebuild Harriet Jacobs' attic. So I rebuilt it to scale with wood from Chicago's oldest housing project, Lakewood Homes, from the wood from the trees in the park at Lathrop, where people played. And I filled it with text that I used to produce the lecture. These were books addressing prison and police abolition, prison and slave uprisings, attempts at marriage, attempts toward liberatory architecture and radical architectural histories and so on, and also incidents in the life of a slave girl. Toward the end of that project, I was going through a really difficult breakup, and I was thinking I wanted to make a work called The Loneliest Black Woman in the World. That hasn't been made yet. But someday. Anyway, so I was like, that's the title. Whatever it is, that's the title. And I was thinking, where should that work take place? Where do we find the loneliest Black women in the world? And one day I was in the waiting room at Stateville Prison, and it came to me. Because I can think of few places where more lonely Black and brown women regularly congregate. Prison lobbies are usually full of women because women are caretakers. And there's all kinds of energy in the space. You know, people come excited to see loved ones. They come pissed off that they're back. They come tired from the journey. They come whatever they're feeling about their kids that day. They come with all the things. And it's all in a tiny, tiny little space. Tiny space. Sometimes no bigger than a hallway. Several times a month, I'd have a range of experiences in these rooms, built in such a way as to deter human potential. And it's not just the architecture of the space, but also the infrastructure of the space. These are rooms, a lot of times without heat or airflow, with disgusting bathrooms covered with rust and mold. And then there's the anteroom where they search through your hair and they make you lift up your bra and they feel around your underwear and they make you dump out your shoes and they look under your tongue and they feel through your coat and all these things, right? They're horrible places. The prison waiting room was and is a place abundant with potential and almost like a hyperactive amount of emotional, political, and social energy being generated and absolutely contained. It has nowhere to go. It felt really perfect for an opera. And opera to me sounds more beautiful than dance lecture, and I wanted to make something beautiful. I wanted to make something really undeniable. I wanted people to want to see the work. And then once they saw it, I wanted them to feel like even if they wanted to forget it, they couldn't because it was so beautiful. And this makes me think of Erica's thesis question around like, how do we change the world with the work? And your answer, which is like, we can change things. Can we change everything? No. No, we can't. But I was really struck by how much I love to see beautiful things that look and sound really good, that even if you have no idea what the fuck is happening in the thing, it's still in your mind. I think there's something about that. I think there's also space for things that are disgusting, horrible, and ugly. I think there's lots of space for that too. But I was really interested in making something about prisons that was beautiful and was undeniable on the level of beauty. And that's why opera. So as part of the research for the opera, I interviewed about a dozen women and trans people who have intimate experience with prison waiting rooms. And I'm just gonna play a clip of Adrienne talking about her visits.
My breath the whole time. Are my clothes right? Do I have enough dollar bills? Should I have left earlier? I'm already sweating. Do I need to reapply lipstick because I can't bring it in? Once I enter a whole nother level of tension because of the guards. I'm really small and pulled into myself. I couldn't love this person more, and I couldn't hate this more. You have to go through this whole thing, all this shit, just for an ounce of relationship. You have to earn it. It erodes you over time. As the girlfriend of someone inside with sex offenses, it's a whole other ballgame with the COs. The waiting room is so hectic, so crowded, lots of informal systems. You need to know all of them. If you don't know them, you'll be told quickly. It's a chaotic, emotional place. People almost getting into fistfights and having each other's backs. Entire relationships are formed. How's the family? How's the job? Did you hear about that new bill that passed? Your father should apply. Let me get you some more information. It's such a terrible place, obviously. designed to do exactly what it's doing. And it becomes blatantly clear that this is what we have, this is how we get through it. All we really have is each other.
So in these interviews, I ask people to recall their journey to the prison building and then into the waiting room and then into the belly of the place. And as you can imagine, memories are faulty according to how recently somebody has been in. But also, prisons are architectures of trauma. As Adrian says, they are designed to do exactly what they're doing. We know that when we encounter trauma, our brains and bodies work to find regulation and to bring us back into alignment. And that can often include placing holes in the memory and putting up walls where, in one's lived experience, there were no walls. So I take the story as they've given it to me, and I try to redraw a site plan of the prison based on their description. And then over that drawing, I collage, which for me is very healing for my own experience. Usually I'm pulling from Black women's magazines, Black hair magazines, animal magazines, fashion magazines. Something about femme life, beauty, wildness, something about freedom, putting that back into the map. What is useful to me here is to get to the opacity of the space, which is revealed through the person's telling and then trying to redraw based on that telling. And I'm saying opacity of space, I'm borrowing this from Catherine McKittrick, who writes about the trouble with the notion of transparent space. She argues that while spaces and architectures in the context of racial capitalism argue for their transparency, like a building is just a building, the street is just a series of buildings, people on the margins and McKittrick would argue, especially Black women, tend to both experience and use space in a much more nuanced and complex way that belies their transparency, like that mother from Pruitt-Igoe. And as Adrian gets to, people will always use the spaces they find themselves in to make more community. When we think about spatial opacity, what we're talking about is the living element that exists beyond the limits of the architectural design itself. For force, I needed a way to choreograph the complex social relationships unfolding in the context of an invisibilized space of the prison waiting room. And so I developed Assembly, which is a movement score that recurs throughout the opera course. And this is a little bit Assembly.
I have a list, Bobby. I have a list of the kinds of pictures I take. Let me just say this, what would typify it would be whatever the storyline is, the plot line, whoever the people are, it would be, you would feel like you had entered into the world where these people live. And it would be the actual world. It would look a lot like any other world. People have the same emotions that what people might call mainstream people have. You know, I've always wanted to see Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon done. When I first mentioned it, when I read this book years ago, people go, oh, they'll never make a movie about, black people that can fly and stuff like that. When it is so much a part of, whether I've seen anybody fly or not, is not the point. But it's a part of our cultural tradition to if somebody said that so-and-so flew, then, well, where did they go? It's not, they were flying? What were they trying to get to?
Crucially, in drawing out this thinking about opacity, I needed to make a libretto that itself would evade easy understanding. One way to think of this is in terms of access points. Some people know some things about prison, and some people know a lot of things about prison, and some people don't know anything about prison. And I'm probably in the first camp. I know some things, but not as much as many other people. I needed to write a script that would call to those who, like me, know some things, but also not a script that would speak on some stuff that's not mine to speak on. I needed to make a script that was very, very personal. Everything, of course, is my own story as a person who goes in. And in the opera, I don't really image the person who lives inside the prison, except for a little bit I do. And how I did that was with the use of an agungun, or the idea of an agungun, which is a Yoruba masquerade, or just generally thinking about diasporic masquerade. When we're talking about African diasporic masquerade, we're usually talking about a kind of collective force of ancestors. And so I was thinking about masquerade here as a collective force of both the living and the dead. Those we know are here in the room with us even when we can't see them. Those others I was talking about earlier, the living and the dead. And it started with just playing with emergency blankets, which is a really lovely material because it's very protective and warming, but also they work as a one-way mirror, emergency blankets, where you can see through them. If you're inside of it with your face up to it, you can see everything, but from any distance, all anyone outside of it can see is a reflection of themselves, or a reflection. They can't see you. And that character is called the Presence. I needed to write a libretto that I understood and that was understandable, at least to some extent, to people like me, people who go in. And I also needed to write something that could demonstrate the boundarylessness of prison. Something really beautiful, but also relevant, which I find hard. I find hard to do. So like, even if you're not a person who goes in, you would get hooked because it's beautiful, but then also there's something in there that's actually about real life, which is not always beautiful. So I needed it to do both things. And I realized that what I needed in the libretto was not actually possible, and so I would need footnotes. So that becomes, both of those elements become really important. The libretto and the 42 or so citations within it. What this is that on the left side, this is a page from the libretto. On the right side is some of the footnotes. And I'll just read a little bit of the footnotes. This is a footnote to the character Rage of the World, who is described as, in part, Alfred Woodard in Brooklyn. Not Carolyn, but Alfred, the actor playing Carolyn in Spike Lee's Brooklyn. Alfred Woodard is a person who knows and embodies the code of Carolyn, and who embodies other codes too, and who might switch from one code to another in body, and yet still somehow be Alfred Woodard. Not Carolyn the powerhouse, at once elevated by her children and curtailed by their precariousness. Not Loretta the single mom addict from down in the Delta. Not Chantel the sidekick from Passion Fish, but Alfred. Alfred Woodard in the role. Miss Woodard's poise is that of a black should-have-been leading lady who used to be a little black girl who regards herself as an entire universe. She sits with herself, has regard for herself, as if in awe of the capacity of this thing that God somehow blessed us all with, herself. As if this thing itself is the actual God-given world. And what's more, Miss Woodard is always a black woman. I mean, she always plays a black woman even when she plays an animal, like Sarabi in The Lion King. She never plays a white character miscast with Alfred Woodard. Even if the character were written white, she would make it black. She always plays and always is a black woman. If you could produce and have control over a film about African American people, what kind of picture would you make? Is what Bobby Wygen asks on the occasion of Brooklyn's release. Woodard's head shakes slightly and she scratches her ear and looks somewhere way over Bobby. Her laugh shakes itself out of her mouth. Let me just say this, she thinks aloud. Whatever the storyline is, it would be, you would feel like you'd entered into the world where these people lived, and it would be the actual world. And that's from her interview with Bobby Wygen in 1994. This is another example. On the left is a page from the libretto, and on the right is the note. And actually, there's a couple notes here. And footnote number 35 is actually on the page before, where one of the characters is talking about grasses. This is not to give it all away. This is the moment where they all realize they've had the same dream. All the characters have had the same dream. They're all in the field together. So someone's talking about grasses. Okay, and here's the footnotes. When she writes whereas, Lady Long Soldier writes a text that makes you exhale audibly, as if in reading it, you realize you've been holding your breath for years. Long Soldier grabs the 2009 Congressional Resolution of Apology to Native Americans and holds it. Like a wrestler, she seizes the language. She pulls it here and there, elongates it, trips it, throws it. At times it is a hole, a box, an arrow. One comes to hate the words of the resolution, the surplus of them. And then she offers a way to love them too, but with nuance and the distrust that comes only with intimacy. In a trans-temporal conversation with M. Norbisi Philip and Sete Adamu Boateng, Long Soldier wades into a forum developed at her peril and pulls out the words of a text written without her consultation. And when I say her, I mean that word as capaciously as possible, a word that includes all of her ancestors, her relatives, and her future ancestors, and at times I think Philip and Boateng and perhaps even me. As one reads, one is haunted by all the words, but the text opens and closes with an invocation, a command to keep the heart of the matter in the breath with the spirit. Now make room in the mouth for grasses, grasses, grasses. And that's from Lady Longsoldier's Whereas. And there's more. So all of these are access points, right? The libretto, the footnotes, the music is an access point. The show itself is an access point. I think it's actually a really beautiful show. I hope you all see it in May. This image also is from the footnotes, and this was my initial imagining of the play space. I was actually hoping that we could build a black box on casters inside any of the theaters where the show would happen, and the performances would happen inside the box and all around the box, and the audience would have to turn the box themselves to see the different parts of the show. That was my fantasy dream, and it didn't happen. It's too hard to do, so we didn't do it. But the idea was that there would be infinite access points that, or at least 4 access points, and you would never be able to actually get everything from any one point. And also you have to do work to get it. The idea is that there's many ways into this story, and none of them is the work in its entirety, and none of them is particularly self-evident. But each access point hopefully offers enough that audiences will find them somewhere in it and want more story because of that, and there's more story. One way to make work in a genocide, especially a genocide that doesn't look and sound like a genocide, that nobody's calling a genocide, is to make it tell a story, I think. And to make it your own story and make it as much of your story as possible. And ask audiences to hold parts of the story with you, or demand that they hold parts of the story with you, to find themselves in the story. To realize that there are enough parts of your story that they can find themselves within it, that it could also be theirs. So that's one idea that I have. And I'll stop there.
Oh. Are you open to questions? Folks out there?
Questions, thoughts, reflections, needs.
Don't forget, I'll just say to you and everyone, thank you. I'm so glad this is recorded because I need to listen to it again. Lady Long Soldier's going to be here in a month's time. So just to let everyone know, that's the 22nd of March. So that's the kind of connection, and really people aren't invited to go down and come along.
That's awesome.
That just came into my head, so I don't forget. But I'll let someone else ask you questions walking up to March.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say more about what draws you to collage. I'm also someone who works a lot with collage and have my own reasons for it, and what you shared was like so beautiful. But yeah, I'm curious, what is it about collage that is healing for you and that speaks to you?
Well, I've been making this opera now for it'll be 5 years in a little bit, and it's a beautiful project, and it's a very exhausting and many times stressful project that involves a lot of people and a lot of money and a lot of my energy in all kinds of ways, like my caretaking, my grant writing, my ability to move puzzle pieces around an Excel spreadsheet, and being a director. And collage is something that I just do on my own at a table. I have magazines because I like magazines, and I sit at my table and I do it. And for me, there's a thing that's revealed through I don't have to make the images. Like they're ready-mades, and what the thing becomes, it reveals itself. It almost requires nothing of me. Just this. It actually requires like pure body and almost no brain. And that is a very helpful way for me to come back into myself. And also because I've been doing these, I've been making collages generally, but also like in line with this project, I'm doing these around these maps too. There's something really helpful for me about seeing the maps. It's affirming for me. As somebody who has gone and can go into prisons and have this really contradictory experience of violence and also like beauty at the same time, it's very affirming to see that get made and exist on a page.
Oh, and that's fun. Sorry, I don't want to miss people. So mine is less fun than collage, unfortunately. Okay. My question is about, you kind of talked about how you have to do a bunch of different hats for getting your offer produced, and like, what is that process like? Because I was trying to produce a play on campus, and I think I might go more stage reading direction, just because there was like so much juggling involved, and I just didn't know how to navigate that space. So like, how do you exist like this? How do you put on the different hats? What is this?
I honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it. I had, when I started, there's an artist in Chicago named Amber Ginsberg who who has recently started this. She bought this church, I think in like 2018, and she had this dream of making this really affordable, accessible art space with studios and like dance rehearsal space and all this really cool shit in this church on the southwest side of Chicago. And I ran into her the other day, and she's about to open the church finally, and we were talking about it, and she was like, it's changed a lot. And it's changed because of like building codes. Like the things that she wanted, it's like, for example, she was trying to put a tiny little apartment for herself and her partner on the top floor. But if she wanted to keep the rental prices as low as they are, it wasn't possible because the fees that she has to pay, the property fees for a public space, are so much higher than if it was a private space. And so she basically had to move her house into the main part of the building and do the thing that she never wanted, which was make a mansion for herself. She had to make a mansion for herself. And we were talking, and she was like, I wanted to make a model of something, but I don't think this can be a model because the system that I'm working inside of it is fundamentally flawed. Like the system prevents the model from existing. And so this is more like a suggestion of one possibility of something, but it's not really a very feasible model. When I started making Force, I had this idea of making a model of a live work that sort of like decolonized itself by resisting all these different violences in the theater. And like, I had all these ideas, and some of them I think we were able to do, but also the nature of making live work in the context that we live in now. I don't know what it's like here at CalArts, but in the United States generally, the arts generally are defunded, and performing arts, especially dance, there's like no funding. There's like no space and no funding. It's a very difficult landscape. And so I realized in the 5 years of doing this that there's a reason why these structures, which oftentimes show up as actually really violent, exist, for better or worse. And yeah, I guess, sorry, this is a long answer, but the short answer would be there's a reason why there's whole infrastructures. Like there's a reason why you have a costume department and a finance department and like all these things that actually tend to can make project's less exciting because you get all this bureaucracy and then you're like, well, now you're running a nonprofit and then you're dealing with like a board. They're just like, it becomes this whole thing, but there's a reason why that exists because it's very difficult to do it in a more, you know, DIY kind of way. I don't know if that relates to your experience at Callards, but
Yes.
that's how my experience has been with it.
I just want to say
It's
something
collage.
that kind of answers, partly answers, that's why I've come for this short, because you partly answered my question about why the opera, which is such an exclusive, such an inaccessible form, and one which is especially, well, it has used black body as a kind of, mostly kind of tenor, maybe, but not as a maker or as a director. So partly about why you use opera, or what, but you kind of partly answered that question, maybe. And also to say something a bit more about the music element of that, because we think it, and you haven't said whether we wrote it sung or spoken, and I just wondered, because opera, that's got that long, very wide history, has these elements and these which we imagine to be in place, one of which is singing, and one of which is some element of music. Sometimes you dance, sometimes not, and I'm not completely sure how that works in the piece you just described.
Yeah, when I started making it, I knew very little about opera. I knew that it had something to do with drama, big drama. And as I said, you know, Golden, high drama. So that was why I started that way. But then as the time went on and the research went on, I learned some things. Are there any opera scholars in the room?
Or aficionados.
Or aficionados? So I always, if I ever
I think opera's cool, but I know very little.
If I ever meet like an opera person, I always ask them, what is an opera? And then the answer, no one has an answer that's the same.
No.
And what I have come to learn is that, you know, like many things, it got codified and there's an idea of what it sounds like. But the clearest response that I get when I speak to opera scholars is that it's big work. It's big work. That's what the word means. And I certainly have made big work. So in that sense, I've made an opera. It is music. It's all music. So in the way that we think about, like when people sometimes are like opera or a musical, and an opera is like continuous music. It is that. It's music going throughout. It's sung. And I don't think I played it in the singing, but yeah, it's sung. And also there's this other thing that, you know, I feel for me, it's an honor to extend the lineage of Black opera makers, of which there are actually quite a few. But we rarely get to see or hear their work because the work got destroyed or didn't get produced or whatever. So
Which is maybe a time to plug the opera that is being produced at the LA Opera right now. Yeah, which is Still.
William Grant Still.
Yeah. This is just a one act, it's like a two-part, because it's a nice split bill because it's African American opera, and then the second half is a Russian piece called The Dwarf. So it'll be interesting to have those together. But my question is maybe connected to something interesting around opera. I feel like I want to go back to the castle for a second, because I think that the links that you're making between the castle, the concentration camp, the prison, and in general, your interest in architecture is very striking. And thinking about architectures, what's contained and what can't be contained within physical spaces and how that relates to the performance space feels like a big context for Force, but maybe for Notes on Territory, and maybe even for Treasure, the book that we had. So that's like a preamble for my specific question, which has to do with beauty. And you're interested in making something beautiful, but a castle is also beautiful. And so thinking about like the treachery of beauty and the treachery of, do you know what I'm saying? There's something interesting because to me the castle is where opera comes in for me, because I feel like, oh yes, these things that were so separate or that were seen so distinct from, the atrocity are actually like the site of the atrocity, or it gets exported as a kind of, anyway, I don't mean to be speaking, I want to ask the actual question, which is about like, yeah, if you wanted to make something beauty, are you ever worried about beauty and about how to navigate beauty and the other side, I guess, or the flip side of beauty in your own, in this work in particular?
Yeah, great question. So one, what actually had happened was we did Notes on Territory, there was a talk back, and there was somebody in the audience who said, why are you showing this work outside of prison? Don't you think that people inside prison, don't you think that that's who actually would understand what it is you're talking about? Which I have a lot to say about, but I'm not gonna go into all of it, but just to say that I was like, oh, when this person said this, I thought to myself, oh, I mean, this is my perfectionist thing, but I was like, I failed. But because I was like, no, this, you do have something to do with this. That was the whole point of Notes on Territory. Slave castles, forts, the history of empire, Western empire, like this is all connected. That was the whole point. But you feel for some reason that this is actually not speaking to you, like you're not implicated in this. And I don't know why, but I took from that, oh, this wasn't nice enough. Like this wasn't like pretty enough for you to just get the little thing that then you walk away and you're like, you see a show and then you go out to dinner after and you want to talk about, oh my God, didn't you love the lights? Like that can be the hook. Mm-hmm. And it is treacherous. It is, because we think that we are somehow here and the prison is over there and they're not related, when there's no way we could be here if not for the theft of this land, the killing of these people, the putting people in prison. If not for all of this, we would not have this. They're absolutely related. I feel it every time I drive from Stateville Prison back to my home in Chicago, and I feel like shit because I've just spent 6 hours in a totally toxic air environment on concrete that's full of rust and asbestos. And then I mean, Chicago's beautiful. If you've ever driven up Lakeshore Drive, it's like gorgeous. You're like, oh my God, this beautiful, beautiful city. There's absolutely no way that the beauty of Chicago exists without the degradation of a place like Stateville. Those two things are absolutely connected. And the fact that that person asked that question, I know I'm a perfectionist. That's my own issue. I gotta let go of that. But the fact that that person asked that question, I was like, oh, somehow I didn't communicate. I didn't do the hook. I didn't get the Trojan horse in so that you could be hooked, so that then you could go have dinner and talk about how nice the lights are. And you're gonna keep thinking about it. And some little droplet of this is gonna touch you and lodge in you, which is what I need to happen. I do think it's treacherous. It can be, and I think that can be helpful. Mm-hmm. But maybe there's also something bad that I'll discover later.
No, and it was not a judgment there. My question, it's just beauty. Have you ever read Anne Carson's The Beauty of the Husband? Mm. Okay, well, it's great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Anybody? Yeah, I
had a kind of simple question, which you might have explained already. I was curious why you chose to focus on the waiting room rather than the visiting room, because those feel like both really emotionally charged environments, having also been in both. Yeah, but I'm so interested in the loneliness aspect of why that's the kind of center from which all of this grows, rather than the more liminal space in a way of insider, outsider. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I have more experience in the waiting room than in the visitor room. And my experiences in the visitor room are very, very complicated as our experiences in prison. But also, for me, they have always felt like I'm with this person that I came to see, and there's a really clear connection that, you still have like this guy like yelling there, or like, whatever the things are, the CO walking, like you still have all the things, but there's something in my own experience in the visitor room that I've just had a more, I've had like a shared intimacy with somebody in a way that I personally haven't experienced that in the lobby. And also because in the lobby, there's this really weirdly broad range of people who's there. Like there's like people going in to visit someone, but there's also like missionaries waiting to go in, and there's lawyers who seem to just be able to do whatever they want, and there's educators, and that's like an interesting tension to me. And then there's also people coming out of the prison to like mop the floors, but aren't there to talk to anybody, right? There's like this weird, okay, there's somebody who's traveling in and out of this space. It's clearly not even a real thing. Like the whole idea of you can't get out is not real. The person's literally could just walk out the door. They're not even there. Yeah, there's something about it for me that both, I think, because I have more experience in that space, but also I personally have felt more like dead. Like I'm in a dead place. Like I'm in like a no place. Like it's, yeah, it feels like a no place more for me personally. And also there's something really interesting to me about the way the waiting room is inside